for starting this. I've learned so much from the program that I've attended, and was so sorry not to be here for John's earlier in the spring. So I think it's a great thing to have the opportunity to learn from one another and from friends and neighbors. So many of you know that Tom and I spend a good deal of time in France. I first went to France when I was a student in the 60s, and Paris was a pretty exciting place then, I can tell you. And then I went again, we went together as a family in 1997 when I was working on a book called Cultural Capitals, Early Modern London and Paris. And I was very interested in that book on the impact of demographic explosions, of the sort of change and growth of cities. In 1580, London had 80,000 people. By the middle of the 17th century, it had 500,000. So it went from being a little town to being a big city really fast. And that demographic explosion had a huge impact, as you might imagine, on theater, because you need people to go to the theater and to fill the seats of the theater. Since then, I've gotten interested in what we call reception. That is, in the reception of Shakespeare in Europe. And in my case, it used to be said that Shakespeare was really unknown on the continent until the middle of the 19th century, 18th century, when the writer Voltaire first spent some time in London and wrote about Shakespeare, introducing him to the French. But we know now that, in fact, that English actors travel the continent and perform in what is now Germany and Holland and the Low Countries, but also they reached Vienna and Prague and even Gdansk in the late 16th and through much of the 17th century. So the traveling English players were so popular that they became a brand, what we would now call a brand. And until the 18th century, troupes made up completely of German actors called themselves English comedians because of the brand, okay? So, some of you may remember that a couple of years ago, it was reported by the New York Times, that a copy of Shakespeare's first folio, that is the collection of his plays published in 1623, soon after his death, was found in a small town library of Saint-Omer near Lille, France. In Shakespeare's day, the town was home to a school for Catholic English boys, and marginalia in that text suggests that it was used for performance. A first folio of Shakespeare's sold at auction in 2008 for $5.2 million. And another unrecorded copy sold this past May for $2.75 million. In other words, it's an immensely valuable and collectible book. So Shakespeare has been much in the news as well because over the last couple of years, we've been celebrating or commemorating, not celebrating, the 400th anniversary of his death. And so there have been RSC productions, the Royal Shakespeare Company productions of Hamlet, for example, toured the world and performed in 97 countries around the globe. And here, this works, is a recent mashup cartoon, which I thought you would enjoy. I say it's a mashup because, as you can see, the blurb is a quote from Macbeth. Shakespeare is speaking, you know from the famous pictures of Shakespeare you've seen, but he's holding a skull as if he were Hamlet. So it's a mashup of three plays, and his amanuensis there is sitting at a laptop complaining that Shakespeare's tweet for Twitter, Trump's media mode of choice, is too long, as you can see. Michael Whitmore, who's the director of the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, reminds us that half of all secondary students around the world study Shakespeare's plays. More Shakespeare movies are produced in Bollywood than in Hollywood, and that Shakespearean characters and references are ubiquitous. They turn up in dystopian novels, and Disney movies and cartoons, Broadway musicals, hip-hop, and the Daily Times crossword. So in short, Shakespeare is a global celebrity. So today I want to talk about a small chapter in that history, the visit, as Jerry mentioned, of English actors that they made in 1827 to Paris. But to do that, I want to start with a little show and tell. John and Holly Perry brought me one night when they came to dinner this dish towel. It's a Shakespeare dish towel. And as you can see at the top it says, everybody dies, okay? And that is often pretty much the case. It itemizes then all the deaths that take place in the play, starting with Romeo and Juliet. And in the early Titus Andronicus, 14 people die, most of them on stage in various gruesome ways. Arms and legs are lopped off, bodies are burned, many characters are stabbed, and 2 are then baked in a pie and fed to their mother. You see what I mean? But there are also many deaths in the better known tragedies. Hamlet has 8, King Lear 9, Macbeth 10, and so on. So Shakespearean drama is filled with onstage violence, just as action films today. But in France, in Shakespeare's day, no one died on stage. Has anyone ever seen a play of Corneille or Racine, who were the great dramatists contemporaneous roughly with Shakespeare? Characters die, of course. I mean, we're talking about tragedy. But they're not maimed or slain on stage. Their bodies aren't baked in pies and they aren't fed to their mothers. French tragedy, unlike English tragedy, conformed to what are often termed the 3 unities associated with Aristotle, the unities of time, place, and action. They had single plots, whereas Shakespeare often had multiple plots. They take place in one location, even sometimes in only one room. Whereas Shakespearean drama travels freely from Egypt to Rome and back again, or from Sicily to Bohemia and back again to Sicily, to give just a couple of examples. Sometimes, and also French tragedies take place often within a 24-hour period, sometimes 3 days, but sometimes in the very 2 hours of the unfolding of the action itself. Whereas a Shakespearean play might take place over a period of months or even years. In The Winter's Tale, famously, a baby is born, and in between Acts 3 and 4, 16 years pass, and she becomes the prince's love interest to ensure the marriage at the end. So French tragedy was also concerned with the fall of the great, not with common men and women. So for many years, the French objected to Shakespeare. They found him, the mix of persons and the onstage violence, grotesque and even disgusting. So translators of Shakespeare into French, in fact, corrected these so-called errors and in various ways, making the English playwright conform more to the conventions of French taste and so forth. Famously, the French refused to translate the word handkerchief into French in Othello, and translators turned Othello's gift to Desdemona into a diamond bandeau or into a love letter and so forth. But the French Revolution brought about many changes, both political and cultural, on both sides of the Channel. And it inaugurated a kind of cultural revolution, which we generally termed Romanticism, which was a movement in the arts and literature that emphasizes notions of genius and inspiration, of the individual and the common man, and an appreciation of nature and the natural world, among other features. And in the wake of the French Revolution, and the interest in representative government it generated and of Napoleonic imperial expansion and the ensuing military rivalry between England and France, English cultural forms began to receive increased attention on the continent. Literary magazines in France began to publish reviews and excerpts of English works and writers that both registered and fostered the Anglophilia that flourished among European romantics. The great French actor Talma, there he is, did much to promote Shakespeare in France by playing Hamlet, even in a much altered French adaptation. And the great French novelist Stendhal wrote his famous pamphlet Racine et Shakespeare, in which he promoted the Romantic movement represented by Shakespeare, as opposed to neoclassicism represented by Racine. And Shakespeare and other English playwrights began to inspire French dramatic writers. But in 1822, when Othello was performed by English actors on the Parisian stage, in the wake of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, as the Shakespearean critic Peter Holland observes, quote, "The combination of French suspicion of the barbaric drama of Shakespeare and the too recent ending of the war in 1815 created a near riot. When Othello begins to smother Desdemona on their marriage bed, the already outraged audience booed the play from the stage, shouting, 'Down with Shakespeare, Wellington's lieutenant.'" 5 years later, however, when the Covent Garden theater manager and actor Charles Kimball brought a troupe of English actors to Paris, where they gave a series of performances at the Odeon Theater, the visit was both an artistic and a financial success. Le Tout Paris attended their performances over some 10 months, and they received a warm reception from both the public and much of the press. The visit prolonged a flurry of romantic artistic activity, dramas by Victor Hugo and Alexandre Dumas, Delacroix's famous series of lithographs and canvases on Hamlet, which some of you may know, Théophile Gautier's libretto for Giselle, which is based on Hamlet, and also some half-dozen works by Berlioz. So commentators have generally claimed this interest was prompted by romantic aesthetic ideals, but there's considerable evidence that cultural competition and expansion were important factors. So the visit of the English troupe in 1827 seems to have been motivated by the search for new markets on both sides of the Channel. The first decades of the 19th century were a very bad moment for Covent Garden and Drury Lane. They were the only theaters in London permitted to perform the serious drama, particularly Shakespeare, and by the first decade of the 19th century, they had fallen on hard times. Not only was there the war with France, but within 6 months' time, both theaters were destroyed by fire. Meanwhile, the smaller London theaters provided plenty of competition, often through performances of Shakespeare that got around the rules by, for example, playing the piano, as in sort of silent movies, through the performance, or merely by changing the name. So Othello became, "Is He Jealous?" So in the fall of 1827, the group of English actors that made its way to Paris then was seeking new markets, and they saw the French capital as a good bet. The visit occasioned a large-scale, it's a folio approximately 18 inches or thereabouts in height, extravagantly illustrated commemorative program of the first half of the season that featured on its cover an image of the very scene from Othello that had very nearly provoked a riot 5 years before. Below, and here, this is the full title page, and here you can see, I'm going to give you a close-up of it, of Act 5, Scene 2 of Othello. So what we see is an illustration of the scene, but one that takes liberties with its Shakespearean original. Here, as you can see, is Desdemona. Her limbs awry, her hair loose and falling down. She's lying across her deathbed in a night dress, and with Othello wearing a sort of exoticizing jalaba at her feet, prostrate on the floor beside her, his face raised to the heavens, as you can see, in grief. And beside his right hand on the floor is a dagger. But on the right is a comically villainous Iago, dressed in 19th century gleaming hip boots, frock coat and hat, more closely resembling Hamlet, perhaps, than the ensign Iago. And instead of a sword, he seems to be carrying a gentleman's walking stick. His eyes are riveted to the tragic loading of the bed, but he seems to be, as you can see, fleeing the scene. Readers of Othello will remember this scene does not correspond at all to Shakespeare's Act 5, Scene 2. For in Shakespeare's play, Desdemona's maid and confidant Emilia is on stage, as are other characters. And in this illustration, most bizarrely, Iago has no sword at all, but the most unexpected difference is perhaps the legend below. I don't know if you can see it. Can you see right below? Good. It says, "Good," with 3 exclamation points. So we have to assume that that's Iago's point of view, since he has been trying to lead Othello, right, to commit this murder. So this image may well have influenced the famous rendering of Ophelia's death in the series of lithographs of Delacroix, The Death of Ophelia. It's sometimes compared. So, 5 years later, the very scene that apparently provoked the French audience to boo Shakespeare from the stage, and which seemed to epitomize English difference, was being used to advertise and celebrate the English actors' Shakespearean performances in Paris. So part of what I'm trying to understand in this work on reception and Shakespeare in Europe is why. Throughout the program, this beautifully illustrated program, there are also small drawings that provide a kind of counterpoint to the large-scale illustrations of scenes that are taken from the productions themselves. So on the title page, for example, you can see, close-up there of it, is a scene from Hamlet, in which Polonius accosts Hamlet reading, but this time the caption actually is from the play itself. It says, "Words, words, words," which is, as I said, a line taken from the play itself. So I've worked on 3 copies of this program, one at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, one in another French collection, and one in the Harvard Theater collection. All 3 include the title page, an introduction, a series of these colored illustrations of various scenes, but the number of scenes represented varies according to, in these various copies. They also have accompanying English verses, then the French translation, and then a commentary as well. So all 3 follow this same procedure: a folio page with the hand-colored lithograph, the Shakespearean lines in English, another folio page with the French translation, and also critical commentary in French. Interspersed among the illustrations of scenes for the plays are engravings of 2 of the actresses, and actually 3 of the actors, but I have 2 here, and with small brief biographies about them. Here is Harriet Smithson, who met Berlioz while in Paris during the run and subsequently married him, and another actress named Maria Foote. The folio programs with their extravagant illustrations were sold at various booksellers and print shops in both Paris and London, both on the right bank, mainly on the right bank in Paris, but also, as I said, 3 in London. So the author of the introduction and critical commentary was a man named Charles-François Jean-Baptiste Moreau, a librettist for the opera comique, and a writer of popular dramatic pieces under a host of pseudonyms. His introduction leaves no doubt that the visit of the English actors to Paris and the program itself played a role in what might be termed the 19th century culture wars. Moreau begins by asserting a new era is opening for literary France. He acknowledges the immortal beauties of Corneille and Racine and Voltaire, but asserts that the grand events, the important events of the last 40 years, that is the French Revolution, right, have changed customs and manners, ideas and belief, not only in politics, but also in literature. And he insists on the relationship between politics and the arts throughout his text. With heavy irony, he observes that it took the fall of one of the oldest monarchies, France, to depose Aristotle and his rules in the realm of culture. And he argues that the new social formations of today are based on debate about the laws that govern subjects, and so it is also with the arts, which can no longer be based, he argues, on 17th century models. So a revolution in the arts is underway, he says, just as the French Revolution had as its immediate cause the bad state of the state's finances, so the theater public also objects to paying for what are mere copies, because the French theater in this period continued to emulate and copy and try to replay Racine and Corneille in the contemporary theater as well. So this art and music, he claims, have already been renewed by David and Rossini. What better moment for Shakespeare in Paris? So he goes on to characterize Shakespeare for his French audience. That is, he acknowledges that Shakespeare had many blemishes, or that spoil the works of what he calls the English Aeschylus. That's how he terms Shakespeare. But he calls upon his readers to transport themselves imaginatively back in time to that century in which this rude genius, represented the history of his people with power and truth, and only then will they appreciate why Shakespeare is so celebrated as to have produced in his own country what Moreau terms a kind of cult. So Shakespeare will help Moreau's countrymen understand that there are other sources of profound emotion than those of 2 centuries past, and will regenerate French tragedy. So that's his argument. He also hints at some interesting questions that are the ones that actually fascinate me. And that also the visit of the English actors that I mentioned earlier raised today. And that is, what did people understand? I mean, try to think of it. I mean, today you can go in France to hear Shakespeare in English, but it's for 3 or 4 days. I mean, you know, a show will come, it will perform, and then it goes, you know, that's it. 10 months. They performed for 10 months. And so the question becomes, what did people actually understand? And we do know that some people, contemporary accounts suggest that some members of the audience had kind of cribs in French. Some had English text, small little texts. We can imagine that the program itself might have worked in a certain way to help people out, but it's still very interesting. So I think part of what happened is that this became a sort of cultural fashion and phenomenon, that people wanted to be there because it was chic. It was where the sort of action was, where it was very avant-garde at that moment in French culture. Then Moreau observes that Shakespeare also, and this is very important too, appeals to the eye as well as to the ear. And he uses that as a kind of segue to talk about the illustrators themselves. They are a portraitist and designer named Achille de Verrières, who, along with Louis Boulanger, who was the illustrator of Victor Hugo, created these illustrations in the program. De Verrières was a well-known designer, a lithographer, a portraitist, and incidentally a pornographer of the period, and a champion of Romanticism. So the illustrations were probably really the main attraction. And this you can see also from the cover, where, as you can see, it says souvenirs of the theater, English theater in Paris, par Monsieur de Verrières et Boulanger. And then in little tiny letters under that it says, avec un texte de Monsieur Moreau, with the text of Monsieur Moreau. So the text is much less important than the images right themselves. So chosen to represent the English actors' performances were 3 scenes from Hamlet. The play scene, this is a very famous scene. You can see that the play is going on in that kind of little framed stage behind. Ophelia is sitting in her chair with Hamlet at her feet. Horatio is leaning against the chair watching. And there are Polonius and Gertrude watching the play as well, the mousetrap. The graveyard scene. And here we have Delacroix in 1828, and from the souvenir, the illustration from the program itself. Ophelia's Madness. There she is. And this is apparently, I'll talk about this in a minute, a very close rendition of Miss Smithson's performance itself. Her costume and hair, Moreau often says things like these images reproduce what you would have seen, or he comments that it retraces a scene. So Moreau's commentaries raise interesting questions about romantic canons of taste, contemporary knowledge of the European literary field, and his own claims to cultural authority. For example, he notes concerning the play scene, the French were also very disturbed by this rendering, which is very typical of the way in which this scene in Hamlet is always produced, because they couldn't imagine why Hamlet would be sitting on the floor. And he actually refers to it as a bizarre posture because it seems so indecorous, so inappropriate for tragic drama. His commentary on Ophelia's mad scene, there it is, also is part of the developing visual tradition. Ophelia is often represented in this way, and we often find her this way throughout the 19th century. So Moreau comments also on the difference between French and English theater with which I began. That is the whole question of onstage violence. And he addresses this question in thinking about the Othello image with which we began. And he, in order to try and protect Shakespeare from being branded as a barbarian in France, he says it was all because of Shakespeare's source, Cinthio, an Italian novella writer, or it was because the actors themselves sort of overplay the drama of these scenes. And so he's always trying, in a sense, to sort of protect Shakespeare from these accusations of barbarity. Anyway, then he ends his commentary by saying, "Here we end this history of the English actors' first season in Paris. We've tried to make them known to those who are not able to see them and to recall them faithfully to those who heard them themselves." So the program then is designed to pique your memory if you were there, or if you were not fortunate enough to be there, to give you some idea of what in fact the performance was like. The final words of the program return us to the question of cultural rivalry with which we began. Moreau claims that it is through such peaceful conquests that two equally proud and generous nations, France and England, will cement a union formed under the auspices of the arts. So here in the aftermath of Waterloo, the celebrated Shakespeare becomes the peaceful conqueror of France through artistic production. So recent work on the notion of celebrity traces a shift in the 19th century from the religious meaning of celebrated, as when we talk about celebrating a mass or celebrating a marriage, right? Meaning performed with due rites, observed with due formality, solemnly held, renowned, honored by a great assembly, and so forth, from the Latin word celebratus, to its more modern meaning, a meaning we know maybe too much about, a person of celebrity, a celebrated person, a public character, often associated with false value. So, for example, the Oxford English Dictionary gives the example, they had celebrity, Spinoza had fame. Spinoza being a great philosopher of the past. So they had celebrity, Spinoza has fame, which suggests that the term already has a derogatory meaning in the 19th century. So Moreau registers this double meaning in his reference to the English propensity to celebrate Shakespeare via a kind of cult, and that's the word he uses. So celebrity has come to embody ambiguity, both defaced value and prized commodity value, which has spilled over not only into cultural life and forms, but also, as we know, political life. In Paris in the 1820s, Shakespeare occupied an ambiguous position, somewhere between celebrated and celebrity, both defaced value through his notoriety and his barbarousness, and prized commodity value called upon to reinvigorate and refinance a moribund French stage. So Shakespeare's celebrity offered a new representation of value around emotion, affect, and a lingering Enlightenment discourse of universalism. Shakespeare, as celebrity, helped to structure meaning, to crystallize the ideological positions of the ancients and the moderns, neoclassic and romantic, and provided a certain coherence registered in the discourse produced by Shakespeare as a marketable cultural commodity. Mark Zuckerberg has suggested that scientists should be treated as celebrities, and that Albert Einstein was in fact a celebrity in his own time. Former presidential candidate Marco Rubio headed in for philosophy majors, you may remember, even though data shows that philosophy majors are tied with math majors for the highest percentage increase from starting to mid-career salaries. Yet science and the humanities, knowledge and imagination, statistics and the arts are set up as opposites, the so-called two cultures. And the humanities, art, music, literature, and drama, are increasingly expendable, cut from the curricula in public schools in favor of the so-called STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Literature teachers are pressed increasingly to set their students to reading train schedules and EPA reports, so-called practical reading, instead of novels, poetry, and drama. And American students continue to fall behind their international peers in reading and math. Perhaps it is because, as Einstein observed, imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world. Neuroscientists have found that at breakthrough moments of insight that lead to key discoveries in math and science and among inventors and innovators, a key area of the brain associated with language and the recognition of literary themes and metaphors and the interpretation of metaphors becomes extraordinarily active in the second before the insight or breakthrough, the eureka moment. Literature matters. In Shakespeare's famous, now even hackneyed lines, imagination bodies forth the forms of things unknown. The poet's pen turns them to shapes and gives to airy nothing a local habitation and a name. Thanks.
Yeah.